Ei Capalla.
Se oli tuo varjo näkyy. Varjo
sun tuossa kanssa. Tarkentaa sen tuon.
Anna.
Okei.
Joo, se on paras. Joo, saat pidännellä teemään.
Mulla oli just vaikka
kesän nimi on
voidaan tässä testaamaan sitä toimiiko se lähetys. Ja se on semmoinen koulutettu, jos mä oon hyväksytty, jos se toimisi.
Millä nimellä toi YouTube?
Se on mun eläkkeiden Miira, mutta siellä on toimiston meili. Mä en osaa vaihtaa. Se on Iira Launea sen ei se ole Iira Launea. Siis nämä menee niin vähän eteenpäin. Onko se talti?
Joo, kaikki talti.
Sitten mä laitan tälle toisen.
Sitten sä voit käyttää sitä, koska
en mä ole siis käyttämässäkään. Mä menen nyt, mun on pakko päästä tänne ja sitten vaan laittaa se linkki. Voit sä jakaa se, lähetä mulle se linkki tohon noin. Niin
tuolta se linkki otetaan se ulos ja hallitaan. Tiedonhallinta.
Mistä mä saan sen?
Tänne chattiin sä voisit.
Mä ymmärrän, mä en halua kirjoittaa mitään. Voit sä nyt vaan laittaa sen linkin? Ja siinä oli yksi vara, mikä nyt sitten rouva tai jäseni kävi kuunnassa. Tuohon tulee vapaa. Tuohon tulee vapaa.
Joo, tuossa on se linkki.
Kokeilemme siinä. Ja sitten tuonne. No.
Minun osuutenihan jäi tästä juuri pois, eli mä olen tosi onnellinen, koska ei tarvitsekaan testata kuvajournalisteja, koska ei mennytkään ihan silleen. Mutta minä olen siis hyvin onnellinen. Mutta
hyvä. Kuka sen siis esittelee?
Niitä ei esitellä, koska tämä ei ole meidän tuoma tänne.
Okei, kuka?
Niin se menee nyt vaan niin näin.
Hyvä.
Mutta niin siis kysymys tästä, että yleisölle ehkä olisi kiva tietää, että tämä niin tulee sitten johonkin tai kuvataan. Ja sitten jos ihmiset niin kyselee, että hei, täällä on kamerat, että mitä on menossa ja näin, niin mitä tästä sun jutusta jos sanoo?
Voi sanoa, että mulla on tällä hetkellä live-striimaus sekä perisportti että juttua.
Joo. Eli YouTubeen. sanotaanko se YouTubeen menee?
Se menee siis joo, sit YouTubessa voi olla, että siellä se tulee olla sitten niin katsomassa myös editoitu myöhemmin. Nyt se menee livenä koko ajan sitten ja periskooppi, katsotaan nyt mikä tässä onnistuu. Mä teen kahta livenä. Joku. Kato. Täällä oli vähän huono nettiesteys, niin myöskin jälkeen oman boksi.
Noniin.
Jotta me näkee.
Hyvä. Eli YouTube.
YouTube löytyy Iralla on.
Se on tällä hetkellä vaan, mun pitää muuttaa se käyttäjä.
Mutta siis silleen, niin kuin, että eikö se ollut ajatus, että tulisi myös silleen myöhemmin? Ehkä
se on tallentuu koko ajan.
Joo, se tallentuu. Se tulee tallentaa.
No, mutta jos mä sanon, kun sitten ihmisille, kun kaikki sit kyselee, että hei, miksi on kamerat ja mihin mennään ja silleen, niin sitten, että on niin kuin sanottu, että mistä on kysymys.
Että me jaetaan sitten se linkki YouTubeen, niin kun se voidaan misten tilillä.
Joo.
Sitten se on vähän editoitu. Mä pistän tän nyt tämän Safarin kiinni, tätä meitä.
Sitten tuossa voisit jakaa.
En mä jaa nyt.
Kuvajournalisteille.
Mä jaa sit siitä. Arvotaan täällä mielessä. Eikö sä nyt laita sen? Sä alkaa 7 se lähetys, miksi sun pitää 7 minuuttia kuvata niin hyvä lava?
Tai voisin se tuossa.
Sitten toiselle puolelle. Tuossa. Tää.
Okei, tervetuloa kaikille. Tämä on 5.6 Klubi ja meillä on täällä tänään erityisvieras. Tässä alkuun lyhyt selostus suomeksi, sen jälkeen käännetään englanniksi. Yrittäkää ymmärtää. Ensin siis käytännön asioita. Täällä on siis videonauhoitus, joka menee opetuskäyttöön. Sitten täällä on striimaaja ja valokuvaaja. Älkää häiriintykö. Jos ette halua päätyä nauhalle, niin pysykää poissa. Sitten toinen nimeen liittyvä verbaalistekninen asia. Illan esiintyjämme on nimeltään Allan A.D.Coleman. Hän on sekä kriitikko että valokuvapohjainen taiteilija. Hänen kriitikkonimensä on A.D.Coleman ja hänen taiteilijanimensä on Allan A.D.Coleman. Tietäkää tämä. Ja nyt käännän englanniksi. Okay, welcome everyone. We have a very special guest tonight, all the way from New York. We are very happy to have him here. He is Allan A.D.Coleman, who is currently celebrating his 50th year as a critic, historian, and curator of photography and photo-based art. Welcome. Here, he's here. Yes. Tonight's program will be divided into two separate parts. First, we will hear about the groundbreaking research of Coleman and his team concerning the iconic photographs taken by Robert Capa during the invasion of Normandy in 1944. Following the lecture and the discussion, Coleman will switch roles from researcher to artist and poet. So he will be Allan A.D.Coleman from A.D.Coleman and present a live version of the multimedia work called Spine, that's Selkäranka in Finnish, if I have translated it right. The project is a collaboration with Finnish photographer Niina Sedenham, who is here, and Finnish musician and composer Mikko Hassinen. Please welcome Allan A.D.Coleman.
Okay. Is this okay, Esko? Everyone can hear me? Yes. Louder? Anyone? Good? It's good. Okay. And Eero, okay for you? Okay. At the moment, for the next 45 minutes, I will be A.D.Coleman. And before I start, actually, let me do a little bit of announcement, which is that tomorrow night I'll be giving a different lecture than either of the things I'm going to be presenting tonight at the Arcada space. You probably know the school, and that's a lecture on a different subject on my work as a photo critic and how photo criticism has changed over the past 5 decades. So we have some folders here with the address and the time if you want these. Come up after the talk or in the break and get them. Okay, so what I'm going to give you tonight or present is a brief overview of an investigation. Esko, we can put the first slide up. Yeah. Of an investigation that began almost 4 years ago, which has been led by me. Oh, we should all thank our sponsors. Go back one, please, Esko. The Allan and Bo Hjelt Foundation are the ones, it's the organization that has brought me here and supported my travel over. And then all of these wonderful organizations have decided in one way or another to participate in it in various ways. So I want to thank all of them. And I also, by the way, want to thank Finns and Finland for naming a day after me, which was Sunday. That was such an honor. You can't imagine how touched I was to find out that as part of this trip, you've named the day. Next year, you could name it for someone else. That would be nice. Okay, so, all right. So as was just mentioned, presently I'm celebrating my 50th year of work as a photo critic and historian and teacher and curator. And almost the last 5 years of my work have been devoted in large part to research on Robert Capa's D-Day experiences and the subsequent fate of his negatives. And this investigation began in late May of 2014, which was June 6, 2014 was the 70th anniversary of the D-Day invasion of Normandy by the Allied forces. And coming up in June 6th of this year will be the 75th anniversary. So this investigation will span those two anniversaries, but you will also have a chance very soon to see how the media deal with Robert Capa's photographs on the 75th anniversary. And I'm hoping that this talk will enrich that and maybe enable some critical thinking on your part about how Robert Capa's photographs are treated in the mass media, especially on this sort of occasion. So, as I said, I've been the primary leader of the research and a primary writer on the research, but it really has been a team effort involving the work of a photojournalist, J. Ross Bowman, from the States, all of these people from the States, photo historian Rob McElroy, and ex-infantryman and amateur military historian Charles Herrick. And in a nutshell, our project dismantles the 74-year-old myth of Robert Capa's actions on D-Day, June 6, 1944, and the story of the subsequent fate of his negatives. If you have even a passing familiarity with the history of photojournalism, or simply an awareness of 20th century cultural history on both sides of the Atlantic, you have surely heard this story because it's been repeated hundreds, maybe even thousands of times. Esco? The story goes like this. Robert Capa landed on Omaha Beach with the first wave of assault troops at 6:30 on the morning of June 6, 1944, D-Day, on freelance assignment from Life magazine. He stayed there for 90 minutes until he either inexplicably ran out of film or his camera jammed. During that time, he made somewhere between 72 and 144 35mm black and white exposures of the Allied invasion of Normandy on Kodak Super XX film. Upon landing back in England the next day, he sent all his film via courier to assistant picture editor John Morris at Life's London office instead of delivering it in person. The shipment included pre-invasion reportage of the troops boarding and crossing the English Channel, the just mentioned coverage of the battle on Omaha Beach, and images of medics tending to the wounded on the return trip. When the film finally arrived in London around 9 p.m., the head of Life's London darkroom, one Brady Bradshaw, inexplicably assigned the task of developing these crucial 4 rolls of 35mm Omaha Beach images to one of the least experienced members of his staff, 15-year-old darkroom lad, Dennis Banks. After successfully processing the 35mm films, in his haste to help Morris beat the looming deadline, Banks absentmindedly closed the doors of the darkroom's film drying cabinet, which inexplicably were normally kept open. Inexplicably, nobody noticed that Banks had closed them. As a result, after just a few minutes, that enclosed space with a small electric heating coil on its floor inexplicably became so drastically overheated that it melted the emulsion of Capa's 35mm negatives. Notified of this by the horrified Banks, Morris rushed to the darkroom, discovering that 11 of Capa's negatives had survived. Yes.
So this is the first one still. Oh, because they are not moving now.
They are not moving.
I will try to speak with you.
Yeah, okay. All right. Interesting. They were working fine before, but here we go. Okay.
Somewhere around here, maybe?
Yeah, keep going. One more. Yep, next. Yep, next. Okay. So, notified of this by the horrified Banks, Morris rushed to the darkroom, discovering that 11 of Capa's negatives had survived, which he saved or salvaged, and which proved just sufficient enough to fulfill this crucial assignment to the satisfaction of Life's London editors. That darkroom catastrophe blurred slightly the remaining negatives, ironically adding to their expressiveness. Furthermore, as a result of the overheating, the emulsion on those 11 negatives inexplicably slid a few millimeters sideways on their acetate backing, resulting in a visible intrusion of the film's sprocket holes into the image area. Now, this standard narrative constitutes photojournalism's most potent and durable myth. From it springs the image of the intrepid photojournalist as heroic loner, risking everything to bear witness for humanity, yet at the mercy of corporate forces that, by cynical choice or sheer ineptitude, can in an instant erase from the historical record the only traces of a crucial passage in world events. Moreover, it represents arguably the most widely familiar bit of folklore in the history of the medium of photography, one that appears not only in histories of photography and histories of photojournalism, but in biographies of and other books about Capa, in novels, graphic novels, the autobiographies of such famous people as director Sam Fuller and actress Ingrid Bergman, assorted films, and even in videos of Steven Spielberg talking about his inspirations for the opening scenes of his film Saving Private Ryan, not to mention countless retellings in the mass media. Yeah. So this is an analysis by Ross Borman of one of Capa's 11 images. Ross, by the way, is an experienced combat photographer. And this is a kind of contact sheet that the International Center of Photography has created, and those annotations there are mine. Okay, so let's hold there. An early version of this story started to circulate immediately after D-Day. It made its first half-formed appearance in print in the fall of 1944, and it received its full formal authorization with the publication of Capa's autobiographical novel, or highly novel fictionalized autobiography, Slightly Out of Focus, which was published in the fall of 1947. Since then, it has been reiterated endlessly, either by John Morris or by others quoting or paraphrasing either Capa's or Morris's version of the story, or both. It gets retold in the mass media with special frequency on every major celebration of D-Day, the 50th, the 60th, most recently the 70th, and as I mentioned, upcoming in a few months, the 75th. In short, it has gradually achieved the status of legend. That this legend went unexamined for 7 decades serves as a measure of its appeal, not just to photojournalists and to others involved professionally with photography, and to the medium's growing audience, but even to the general public. For 70 years, despite the many glaring holes in it, no one questioned this story, least of all those in charge of the International Center of Photography, which houses the Capa archive. Those figures have included the late Cornel Capa, who was Robert Capa's younger brother and the founder of the International Center, the late Richard Whalen, who was Robert Capa's authorized biographer and the first curator of that archive, and Whalen's successor in that curatorial role, Cynthia Young, who's now the curator of the Capa archive. Now, ironically, two celebrations of the 70th anniversary of Capa's D-Day images provoked our investigation. The first came as a flattering profile of John Morris, which was written by Marie Brenner, an investigative journalist for Vanity Fair magazine, published just before D-Day 1970. Morris, as I mentioned, served as assistant picture editor in Life's London Bureau, the magazine's D-Day coverage. And in this Brenner piece, he recounts, almost word for word, his version of the Capa Life D-Day myth one more time. Shortly thereafter, on May 29, 2014, Time Incorporated, the corporation that had commissioned Capa's D-Day photographs in the first place, posted a video at its website celebrating those photographs, which some refer to as the Magnificent 11. A division of Magnum Photos, the picture agency that Robert Capa founded with his colleagues in 1947, the same year he published that memoir, produced that video for Time. And the International Center of Photography's licensed the use of Capa's images for this video. And no one else but John Morris, who was by then 97 years old and living in Paris, produced the voiceover for that video, his boilerplate narrative of these events. In short, this video involved the combined energies of the individual and institutional forces involved in the creation and propagation of this myth, what I came to define as the Capa Consortium. Okay, we'll hold on that for a bit. Assorted elements of those two virtually identical versions of the standard story, Brenner's version and Time Incorporated's version, struck J. Ross Bauman as illogical and implausible. Bauman is the youngest photojournalist ever to win a Pulitzer Prize in 1978 at the age of 24, and he's an experienced combat photographer who has worked in war zones in the Middle East, El Salvador, Rhodesia, and elsewhere. As the founder of the picture agency Visions, which specialized in such work, that is, coverage of war-torn areas, he's also an experienced picture editor. Ross contacted me to ask if I would publish his analysis at my blog, Photocritic International, as a guest post, and I agreed. In the editorial process of fact-checking and sourcing Bauman's skeptical response to the standard narrative produced by Morris in that video, my own bullshit detector began to sound the alarm. I realized that Bauman's critique raised more questions than it answered, requiring much more research and writing than I could reasonably request from him. So I decided to pursue these issues further myself. This immersed me in the Capa literature for the first time. Now, speaking as a scholar, that came as a rude awakening. The most immediate shock hit as I read through a half dozen print and online versions of Morris's account of those events, in Brenner's 2014 puff piece, in Morris's 1998 memoir, and in various interviews, profiles, and articles, and watched at least as many online videos and films featuring Morris rehashing the tale. I realized that the only portion of this story that Morris claimed to have witnessed firsthand, the loss of Capa's films in Life's London Darkroom, could not possibly have happened the way that he'd said. In retrospect, I cannot understand how so many people in the field, working photographers among them, accepted uncritically the unlikely and unprecedented story concocted by Morris of Capa's 35mm Kodak Super XX film emulsion melting in a film drying cabinet on the night of June 7, 1944. Anyone familiar with photographic materials and normal darkroom procedures and practice worldwide must consider this fabulation incredible on its face. Coil heaters in wooden film drying cabinets circa 1944 did not ever produce high levels of heat. Black and white film emulsions of that time did not melt even after brief exposure to high heat. and the doors of film drying cabinets are normally kept closed, not open, since the primary function of such cabinets is to prevent dirt from adhering to the sticky emulsion of wet film. I'm speaking to a room mostly full of photographers. I assume you all understand this. So no one with darkroom experience could have come up with this notion. Only someone entirely ignorant of photographic materials and processes, like Morris, could have imagined it. Embarrassingly, none of that set my own alarm bells ringing until I started to fact-check the article by Bauman that initiated this project, close to 50 years after I first read that fable in Capa's memoir. This is one of several big lies permeating the literature on Robert Capa. Certainly Capa knew it was untrue when he published it in his memoir. He had gotten his start in photography as a darkroom assistant in Simon Gutmann's DFOT photo agency in Berlin. And Cornel Capa also knew that. He had cut his eye teeth in the medium, first by developing the films of his brother and Henri Cartier-Bresson and David Seymour in Paris, then by working in the darkroom of the picture agency Pix in New York, then by moving on to film the same role at Life magazine before finally becoming a photographer in his own right. My belated recognition of that fact led me to ask the obvious next question. If that didn't happen to Capa's 35mm D-Day films, what did? And if all these people were willing to lie about this, what would they cover up? So, building on Bauman's initial provocation, I began drafting my own extensions of what he'd initiated, and our investigation was launched. Earlier this year, I published what I think is about the 85th chapter of our research project. You'll find all of it online at my blog, and the easiest way to get to the Capa D-Day material is by using the URL capadday.com, capadday.com. During these years, I've become intimately familiar with a large chunk of what others have written and said about Capa and his D-Day coverage. In my opinion, the bulk of the published writing and presentations in other formats, film, videos, exhibitions, devoted to the life and work of photojournalist Robert Capa, qualifies as hagiography, not scholarship. Capa's own account of his World War II experiences, slightly out of focus, consistently proves itself inaccurate and unreliable, masking its sly self-aggrandizement with wry humor and self-deprecation. Morris's memoir repeats Capa's combat stories unquestioningly, adding to those his own dubious saga of the ruined negatives. Biographer Richard Whalen's books, widely considered the key reference works on Capa, simply quote or paraphrase Capa and Morris uncritically, perhaps because they were sponsored, subsidized, published, and endorsed most prominently and extensively by the estate of Robert Capa and the Fund for Concerned Photography, both of those controlled by Capa's younger brother Cornel, and then the International Center of Photography, founded by Cornel, who also served as ICP's first director. Produced in most other cases under Cornel's watchful eye with the supervision of one or another participant in the Capa consortium, the remainder of the serious scholarly literature on Robert Capa has almost all been subject to Cornel's approval and reliant on either the problematic principal reference works by Whalen or on Robert Capa material stored in Cornel's private home in Manhattan, with access dependent on his consent. Consequently, it constitutes an inherently limited corpus of contaminated research, fatally corrupted by its unswerving allegiance to both its patron and its patron saint. Such bespoke scholarship becomes automatically suspect. Yes, go. Okay, go back one. The second failing of this heap of compromised materials resides in its reliance on untrustworthy and far from neutral sources. Robert Capa, with a demonstrated penchant for self-mythification, his younger brother Cornel, a classic art widower with every reason to enhance his brother's reputation, and Robert's close friend and Cornel's, John Morris, whose own stature in the field premised itself on the Capa D-Day legend. Only Alex Kershaw's unauthorized Capa biography, called Blood and Champagne, published in 2002, maintains its independence from Cornell's influence, but at the cost of losing access to the primary research materials and consequently reiterating the erroneous information in the accounts of Capa, Mars, and Whelan. Virtually everything else published about Capa, including those stories in the mass media that appear predictably every 5 years, along with celebrations of D-Day, unquestioningly presents the prevailing myth. This Capa literature suffers from a third fundamental flaw. Those generating it, with the exception of Capa himself and his brother Cornell, have or had no direct hands-on knowledge of photographic production. They had no military background, which is significant in that Capa's most important work, as you know, falls under the heading of combat photography, and no forensic skills relevant to the analysis of photographic materials. Nor were they encouraged by their patron, Cornell Capa, to make up for those deficiencies by involving others with those competencies in their projects. Instead, their privileged relationship to the primary materials, along with the availability of a prominent and well-funded platform, the International Center of Photography, enabled them to effectively invent whatever suited them, please their benefactor, and serve their purposes. Responsible Capa scholarship, therefore, must begin by distrusting the extant literature, turning instead to the photographs themselves and relevant documents that the Capa estate and ICP do not control, and to which they therefore cannot prohibit access. Those materials lie at the core of our research project. In the short time we have today, I can only summarize what we've found. Capa sailed across the English Channel on the USS Samuel Chase. According to the official history of the US Coast Guard, 15 waves of LCVPs, commonly called Higgins boats, carrying troops, left the USS Chase for Omaha Beach that morning. Capa almost certainly rode in with Colonel George Taylor and his staff, the command group of Company E of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st U.S. Division, to which Capa had been in fact assigned. They constitute part of the 13th wave. That wave arrived at the Easy Red sector of Omaha Beach at 8:15, a half hour after the last of the 16th Infantry Regiment's 9 rifle companies. We can see from Capa's images that numerous waves of troops preceded him. You can see at roughly probably 15-minute intervals, at least 4 rows of troops here, making it very clear that Capa did not come in on the first wave because he's photographing them from behind and photographing their progress. Using distinctive landmarks visible in Capa's photos, Charles Herrick has pinpointed exactly where Capa landed on Easy Red, the beach at Colleville-sur-Mer. Gap Assault Team 10, go back one, would you? Gap Assault Team 10, where you can see clearing obstacles here, had charge of the obstacles in that sector. An existing exit off this sector made it possible to reach the top of the bluffs with relative ease. Colonel Taylor would become famous for announcing to the hesitant troops he found there, 2 kinds of people are staying on the beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. And urging them up the Colleville-sur-Mer draw to the bluffs above, where they extinguished several of the German installations, making it possible for more troops to flow through, Allied troops. Fortuitously, that particular stretch of Easy Red represented a seam in the German defenses, a weak point at the far end of the effective range of 2 widely separated German blockhouses. Both cannon fire and small arms fire there proved relatively light, which is one reason for the success of Gap Assault Team 10 in clearing obstacles in that area. And this explains why, contrary to Life's captions and most subsequent captions, and Capa's own later narratives, his images show no carnage, no floating bodies and body parts, no discarded equipment, and no bullet or shell splashes. This also explains why the Allies broke through early at that very point. Capa did not run out of film. Next slide. did not run out of film, nor did his camera jam, nor did seawater damage either his cameras or his film. In his memoir, Capa first implies that he exposed at most 2 full rolls of 35mm film, 1 roll in each of his 2 Contax 2 rangefinder cameras. He carried a spare, a backup. 72 frames in all at Omaha Beach. By the end of that chapter in his memoir, this has somehow grown to 106 pictures in all, of which only 8 were salvaged. John Morris claims he received 4 rolls of Omaha Beach negatives from Capa. We find no reason to believe that Capa made more than the 10 35mm images of which we have physical evidence on Omaha Beach. Capa made the first 5 of those images, which we've already seen, while standing for almost 2 minutes on the ramp of the landing craft that brought him there. In them, we see Capa's traveling companions carrying not small arms assault weapons, but bulky oilskin-wrapped bundles, most likely radios and other supplies for the command post they had come to establish. Capa made his 6th exposure from behind a mined iron hedgehog, one of, that's that one right up there on the far upper right. One of many such obstacles protecting what Nazi German Erwin Rommel called the Atlantic Wall. He made his last 4 exposures, including the so-called face in the surf, those are the ones on the bottom row, from behind Armored Assault Vehicle 10, which was sitting in the surf, shelling the gun emplacements on the bluffs. Capa described Armored Assault Vehicle 10, which appears on the left-hand side of several of his earlier images that we saw. Would you go back a couple? There. Yeah, you can see. No, now go forward. Huh? That's Armored Assault Vehicle 10 there. Capa described that assault vehicle as, quote, one of our half-burnt amphibious tanks. In fact, it was a modified American tank, a wading Sherman, so-called, not amphibious, merely waterproofed to the top of its treads, and not burnt out. Later images made by others on that stretch of beach show this tank undamaged, closer to the dry beach, and apparently still in action. So taken in conjunction with the known presence at that point of Gap Assault Team 10, and those are the people you see submerged in the water behind those 2 obstacles. The large number 10 on this vehicle's rear vent suggests that it was a so-called tank dozer, one of which landed with each demolition team that morning. The US Army had modified these tanks by adding detachable bulldozer blades, enabling the tanks to clear the wreckage as the engineers blew up the obstacles. Not incidentally, both the time and the place of Capa's arrival on Easy Red contradict the current identification of Houston Hugh Riley as the face in the surf in Capa's next to last exposure, as well as the earlier identification of the face in the surf as Private Edward J. Reagan. Both of these soldiers arrived at different times than Capa and on different sections of the beach. So the identity of the face in the surf, in fact, remains unknown. After no more than 30 minutes on the beach, and perhaps as little as 15 minutes there, we go to the next slide. Next slide, too. Okay. Yeah, that's the face in the surf. So we still don't know who that is. After no more than 30 minutes on the beach, and perhaps as little as 15 minutes there, Capa ran to a landing craft, LCIL 94, where he took shelter before his departure from the beach at around $900, before its departure from the beach around 9 o'clock in the morning. Capa claimed that he had reached the dry beach and then experienced a panic attack, causing him to escape from the combat zone. So we must consider the possibility that he suffered from what they then called shell shock and what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But we must also consider the possibility that even before setting out that morning, Capa made a calculated decision to leave the battle at the first opportunity in order to get his films to London in time to make the deadline for Life's next issue. If he missed that deadline, any images he made of the landing would become old news, and his effort and risk in making them would have been for nothing. No fewer than 4 witnesses placed Capa on this vessel, LCIL 94. The first 3 were crew members, Charles Jarreau, Clifford Lewis, and Victor Habush. According to Capa, once he reached LCIL 94, he put away his Contax 2, working thenceforth only with his 2¼ Rolleiflex. One of the 2¼ images he made while aboard this vessel, published in the D-Day feature story in Life, show Bush assisting a medic treating a casualty. And before we leave this slide, I just want you to notice this little ghost up in this corner. We'll come back to this. Okay, next slide. That negative, by the way, disappeared and has never been seen again. So all subsequent prints and reproductions of it are made from a copy negative of a surviving press print. Next. Next. Okay, next. So here's the story that is supported by the documentation and by the photographs themselves. Okay, so this is what happens after he gets back. But let's wait right there and actually go back one if you would. Thank you. Yeah, good. The fourth witness to Capa's presence on LCIL 94 was U.S. Coast Guard Chief Photographer's mate David T. Ruley. Ruley was a U.S. Coast Guard cinematographer assigned by coincidence to film the invasion on color film from the vantage point of this vessel that Capa coincidentally climbed aboard to get back. Coincidentally, he documented its arrival at the very same spot where Capa landed, recording the same scene from a perspective different slightly from Capa's at approximately the same time that Capa made his 10 exposures. And we'll see those images in a minute. Go ahead, next slide. Next. So this is how the story presumably continues. We have reason to question about this. So this is how the story appeared in Life magazine. This is the Dateline issue, the issue Dateline June 19th, which actually appeared on newsstands on June 12th, 6 days after D-Day, which shows how fast the production was and also shows how urgent it was for Capa's films to reach New York, because they had to leave London on the morning of the 8th, June 8th, and get to New York on, I think it was June 10th, in order to get edited, laid out, and sent to the printer. It got printed over the weekend, and on Monday, June 12th, that issue appeared on the newsstands. Next. Okay. So let's go back to cinematographer David Ruley. Ruley's color footage appears frequently in D-Day documentaries. I spent a lot of time looking at those documentaries as well as looking at Capa's photographs. And at some point, looking again for the 15th, 18th, 20th time at this color film footage, which I did not realize at the time was by David Ruley. I simply realized that the landscape looked familiar. And I emailed to our military historian, Charles Herrick, and I said, is this easy red? Is this that beach? And Charles began doing research from his end on that. And I began doing research on David Ruley. So we verified that these film clips described conditions at that same sector of easy red while Capa was there. And you'll see a couple of slides relating to that. Ruley's name on his slate board at the beginning of several clips enabled us to learn a little bit more about him and his assignment that morning. Most importantly, however, this resulted in the discovery of brief glimpses of Capa himself holding Ruley's slate board in one scene and photographing the offloading of a casualty from LCIL 94 to another vessel in the second clip. These are the only known film or still images of Capa on D-Day, the only film images of him in any combat situation, and among the few known color film clips of him. Next. So, among the things that we've discovered is that the Capa D-Day story includes a number of what we call unsung heroes, and the first of those heroes are the members, the engineers who are part of Gap Assault Team 10, because their breakthrough, their ability to clear those obstacles at that particular juncture, that particular point on Easy Red, enabled troops and materiel and bigger ships to come through right there. And that made possible the Allies' movement up the draw and the breakthrough right there at that point. And for now, almost 75 years, in most usages of those images of Capas, they are identified as terrified troops hiding behind these obstacles, rather than as heroic engineers removing those obstacles so that the Allies can push through. Next. This particular team had more success in demolishing those obstacles than any of the other assault teams on Omaha Beach that morning. They paid a high cost, even though the fire was comparatively light. They had a very high mortality rate. And Capa did not indicate their actual occupation, which he would have known. He would have known what the insignias were on the helmets of these engineers. He didn't indicate them because he provided no captions for those images, and for a long time, no one else recognized them as engineers. So their courage has gone largely unrecognized until now. Next slide. So those are the engineers. This is Capa photographed him first from the back as he was coming in, and then turned around from behind the tank where he was sheltering and photographed him from the front, looking away from the beach. And they are not hiding; they are planting explosives on these obstacles to blow them up. Next, and that's the helmet. Go back one. That's the helmet, and you can clearly see that insignia on two of those, the helmets of two of those engineers. Next. That's the kind of version of what we now call plastic explosive that they were using. And if you look at the green rectangles there, those show the cordite, it was called, the primer cord that was used to blow up things sequentially, to connect explosives and blow them up sequentially. Next. That is Victor Habush, photographed by Robert Capa from LCIL 94. The arrow points to Victor Habush, who was one of the people who recognized Capa and got to know him and recognized himself and recognized the scene in the live photograph. And this is the Capa photograph. Next. And the fourth witness, as I mentioned, is David Ruley, who recorded the same scene from a perspective more or less opposite from Capa. Next slide. This is an article I found by Ruley about making the D-Day color film strips. An article in an obscure film magazine, amateur film magazine from the time. Next. This is Ruli's view from Easy Red of the same shore that Capa was in, and that in the red square up there, that is assault vehicle number 10, the same vehicle that Capa was probably at that moment sheltering behind. And that shape that I pointed out to you in the upper right-hand corner of Capa's face in the surf is actually a ghost shape of this ship behind him in the distance. Next. So here is Capa's face in the surf. And this is Charles Herrick's comparison. And Herrick has basically outlined the items that are in Capa's photograph and shown how they look from Ruli's film, from Ruli's perspective over there. This is the captain of LCIL 94, for some reason known as Popeye. I have never found out why. This is Capa, Robert Capa, aboard LCIL 94, holding David T. Ruli's slave boy on the morning of D-Day. This is that scene by Capa on the right, and this is the same scene of medics attending to wounded infantrymen on the left. A still from another of his clips. That's Robert Capa in the far corner of this landing craft. They're in the process of offloading a wounded or the wounded infantryman from LCIL 94, which is on the far right, onto this small landing craft in order to then transport them over to the USS Chase. You can see Capa's canteen on his left-hand side there, and you can see his canteen on his left-hand side in the photograph by David Sherman that was made when Capa landed back in England, in Weymouth. And that's Capa. You can see his camera bag there over his left shoulder, helping with the offloading of one of the wounded. So you're seeing him here from the rear at the lower left-hand corner. So, in any case, to get back to our narrative, by noon, the battle was largely over. Capa had actually missed most of it because he left as early as he did. The battle on Easy Red. He made the return trip to England aboard the same ship that brought him over, the USS Samuel Chase. Arriving back in Weymouth on the morning of June 7th, he had to wait for the offloading of wounded from the Chase, which was the priority, before he got ashore sometime around 1 p.m. He sent all his film via courier to picture editor John Morris at Life's London office instead of carrying it himself. I'm going to have to revise this slightly because we've actually recently discovered, we haven't published this yet, we've recently discovered that the film went straight to the censorship center of the Allied forces, which explains why it did not arrive in London until hours later. But the late arrival of the film, in any case, at 9 o'clock that night, put Morris and the darkroom staff in crisis mode because it arrived on the night of June 7th at around 9 p.m. And by 9 a.m. the next morning, Morris had to have the package for Life magazine finished, passed once again through the censors and aboard a plane that would take it by an indirect route through Nova Scotia to Washington and then take it up to New York City. So Capa's shipment to Morris included substantial pre-invasion reportage of the troops, as I mentioned, his skimpy coverage of the battle on Omaha Beach, several images of the beach seen from the distance, made while he was leaving on LCIL 94, as well as photos of medics who were tending to the wounded. In addition to several rolls of 120 film and a few 4x5 negatives made on shipboard with what I believe was a borrowed speed graphic, Capa sent Morris at least 5 rolls of 35mm film, and possibly a 6th. These included 2 rolls that he made while boarding and on deck in the daytime, 2 more of a below decks briefing, a missing roll of images made on deck at twilight during the crossing, We know he made it because we have caption notes for it, but no evidence of the film. It may have been seized by the censors. And the 10 Omaha Beach exposures, plus 4 sheets of sketchy handwritten caption notes. Now, all of these films, so far as we could tell, got processed normally and without incident. Surviving negatives from each of these rolls of films, which are housed in the Capa archive at ICP, show no sign of heat damage. So there was no darkroom disaster, no D-Day images got lost, and none, therefore, got saved or salvaged by anyone. In his memoir, Capa wrote that by the time he got back to Omaha Beach on June 8th and joined his press corps colleagues, quote, I had been reported dead by a sergeant who had seen my body floating on the water with my cameras around my neck. I had been missing for 48 hours, my death had become official, and my obituaries had just been released by the censor. End quote. No correspondent has ever corroborated that story. No such obituary ever saw print, as it surely would have. No copy thereof has ever surfaced, and no record of it exists in the censor's logs. This is purest fiction meant for the silver screen. And I should add that Capa wrote his memoir with the intention of marketing it to Hollywood as the treatment for a feature film. So much for the myth. We learned a few other things along the way. Some of these you know. Life magazine ran the best of his 35mm Omaha Beach images in the D-Day issue, dateline June 19th, 1944, hitting the newsstand on June 12th. The other 5 were more or less mediocre variants of the ones that they published. The accompanying story in Life, written by someone who was not there, claimed that as he waited out to get aboard LCIL 94, Capa's cameras got thoroughly soaked. By some miracle, one of them was not too badly damaged and he was able to keep making pictures. That wasn't true, of course, as any of you who are photographers would know. Saltwater would be ruinous to any kind of camera equipment, yet Capa returned immediately to Normandy, landing back there on June 8th and continuing to use the same undamaged equipment with which he had started out on this assignment. No sheet of caption notes for Capa's 10 Omaha Beach images in Capa's own hand exists in the International Center of Photography's Capa archive. Presumably he provided one. Morris himself must have provided some, drafted hastily on the night of June 7th, for both the set of prints that he sent to Life and the set of prints that he sent to the press pool, which was part of the obligation of the Life photographers, was to supply the press pool that different publications could draw from. So that was required by him. As for the captions that appeared with Capa's pictures in the June 19th issue, Richard Whalen writes, quote, Dennis Flanagan, the associate editor who wrote the captions and text that accompanied Capa's images in Life, recalls that he depended on the New York Times for background information, and for specifics, he interpreted what he saw in the photographs. Thus, the wildly inaccurate captions that, to use Roland Barth's terms, anchor Capa's images in Life's D-Day issue, and on which most subsequent republications of these images rely, either got revised from John Morris's last-minute inventions in London, or written entirely from scratch by someone in the New York office, even further away from the action and even less informed about military matters. Life's captions indicated that the soldiers gathered around the obstacles were hiding from enemy fire. We know now that this is not true. The demolition team was enormously successful and deserved credit that they never received. We also learned that ICP had a habit of obstructing any research into the life and work of Robert Capa that did not conform to Cornell Capa's and Richard Whalen's censorious requirements. ICP refused to allow Alex Kershaw to access any of the materials in the Capa archive, as I mentioned, and refused to grant his publishers permission to reproduce any Capa images in his unauthorized biography, published in 2002. It's still a good read. He did a pretty good job. It's worth, if you're really interested in Capa, it's worth reading, because he found some sources, excuse me, he found some sources that Richard Whalen had not found, and that a woman named Josepha Stewart before Whalen had not found. So there's some solid new material in the Kershaw biography. ICP also refused to allow French documentary filmmaker Patrick Jeudi to use any of the primary Capa materials they controlled in his remarkable 2004 film, Robert Capa, L'homme qui voulait croire à sa légende, which translates as Robert Capa, the man who believed his own legend. Upon that film's release, Cornel Capa persuaded John Morris to sue Jeudi in a French court in an unsuccessful attempt to block its distribution. We also discovered that Time had authorized the creation of unlabeled digital fakes of Capa's supposedly ruined and discarded Omaha Beach negatives for insertion into that May 2014 video commission from Magnum in Motion, the multimedia division of Magnum Photos, to celebrate the 70th anniversary of D-Day. Our disclosure of this deception forced Time to acknowledge the fakery and revise that video overnight. Finally, we discovered that Capa's authorized biographer, the late Richard Whalen, lied outright about the emulsion sliding on Capa's D-Day negatives, among other things. And Cynthia Young, Whalen's successor as curator of the Capa archive at the International Center of Photography, not only repeated Whalen's lie, but actually plagiarized it in a 2013 text of her own. So these, before you saw John Morris, Robert Capa himself, and his brother Cornell, that's Richard Whalen, that's Cynthia Young, two curators of the Capa archive. Whalen, the Capa biographer, that's his biography, or the first edition of his biography down there. That's his last book on the far right. This is War, Robert Capa at Work. Next. So since the Capa archive at ICP houses all of those negatives and their contact sheets, let me take a step back. Many of Capa's rolls of film from the 1940s, and not just those he made on D-Day, showed the exposure overlapping the sprocket holes. This resulted from a mismatch, a size mismatch between Kodak 35mm film cassettes and the design of the Contax II, the camera Capa used that day, and not from any damage to the films. So since the Capa archive at ICP houses all those negatives and their contact sheets, both Whalen and Young had to have known this all along. Given the official position that first Whalen and now Young have occupied at ICP as the Capa archivists, they are de facto the world's foremost authorities on Robert Capa. As such, they represent with regrettable accuracy the deplorable condition of Capa scholarship in our time. Next. So here you see the differences. That's a Contax II camera there on the right. Next to it, you see a Super X cassette. Kodak introduced a redesigned and slightly smaller cassette sometime in the late 1930s, after the Contax II had been issued. It became the standard in a fairly short time. But meanwhile, there were cameras out there, and not only the Contax II, but the Leica as well, and several other cameras that were using a slightly larger cassette, and that is the cassette, the standard cassette for the Contax II, created by the Zeiss Corporation. So you can see that slight difference in height. Next slide, you'll see what that does to film. And you can see in the picture, the upper picture there, how blank film inserted in the Contax II drops down slightly and results in that overlap onto of the image area onto the sprocket holes. And then on the bottom, you can see one of Capa's images as if it were the image being exposed right there, and you can see that same effect in positive on the image. This was worked out by Rob McElroy. This is the Time, the still shot of the Time magazine video from 2014, celebrating Capa's D-Day images. Next. And on the bottom right there, you see, on the far right, you see one of the images that Time magazine presented as implicitly an example of Capa's ruined negatives, And right next to it, you see the negative that was the image that was simply grayed out by some graphic artist at Magnum in Motion in order to create a kind of a seeming damaged negative. We actually, if you go to the blog and you start from the beginning of our research, you'll see that for weeks, months actually, I and a cluster of people, including a number of specialists in old photographic equipment and film, were trying to figure out how that happened. I mean, how that image, on the far right there, the bottom right, what kind of damage, what created that? Was it wrong chemistry? Was it, was the water too hot? Was the water too cold? And it turned out there was nothing. It was nothing like that. There was a complete sort of red herring or dead end in the research. Interesting, but basically simply digitally faked. Next. So the myth of Capa's D-Day images, the whole myth of Capa's D-Day and the fate of his Omaha Beach negatives falls apart as soon as you compare his narrative, or the standard narrative, to the military documentation of that epic battle. And it collapses entirely when you examine closely the physical evidence, those photographs and their negatives. The promulgation of that myth by the Capa Consortium, all of whose members have a vested financial and public relations interest in furthering the myth, has proved itself calculated, systematic, duplicitous, and self-serving. Its voluntary dissemination by others, including reputable scholars and journalists, has shown those authors as lazy, careless, and professionally irresponsible. The Capa D-Day myth serves as a classic example of the genesis and evolution of a falsified version of history that, with its emphasis on the exploits of individual actors, like Capa, distracts us from paying attention to the machinations of the corporate structures through which information must pass and get filtered before reaching the public. Powerful institutions with agendas of their own. I would like to think that we have made a sufficiently convincing case that no one can credibly tell the standard Capa D-Day story again, at least not without acknowledging our contrary negative. After all, our investigation forced a reluctant John Morris, the most energetic and vocal proponent of the legend, to recant its central components on Christian Amanpour's CNN show in the fall of 2014. More recently, in a Lens blog piece published in the New York Times on December 6, 2017, just a day before his 100th birthday and months before his death in Paris in July 2018, Morris once again admitted that he had never actually seen any heat-damaged 35mm negatives, that Capa might have only made the 10 surviving images, and that he might have stayed on Omaha Beach only long enough to make them. As for the institutions involved in perpetuating the myth, on June 6, 2016, ICP published this post on the institution's Facebook page. Quote, during the D-Day landing at Omaha Beach, Robert Capa shot 4 rolls of 35mm film. Only 11 frames survived. By accident, the darkroom worker in London ruined the majority of the film. End quote. Since then, grudgingly, as a result of my public prodding, ICP has begun at last to make available to researchers the papers of Cornell Capa, promising to also permit access sometime in the near future to the papers of Richard Whalen, along with the Josephus Stewart interviews from the early 1960s, on which Whalen based much of his work. So there's more work to be done on this subject. For the time being, our investigation has reached a kind of plateau. I've become preoccupied with some other personal matters, but it's far from over. In the US, the Society for Professional Journalists honored our team with the 2014 Sigma Delta Chi Award for research about journalism. Other than that, in the States, our work has received little attention, aside from a feature article in the official journal of the National Press Photographers Association, an article that was so rife with conflict of interest, they were deeply involved with John Morris in many ways, that the watchdog website iMedia Ethics published a lengthy dissection of their article. We've had better luck abroad. The project went viral in France in the summer of 2015. resulting in extensive coverage there in major periodicals and TV stations, as well as responses in Spain, Italy, the UK, Brazil, and elsewhere. I take heart from the fact, that's another slide. Here's my diagram of the Capa consortium. Trying to visualize this cluster of interrelated organizations. Next. These are the early presentations of the myth in book form. Werdenbaker's book on the far left, he was the chief correspondent for Life magazine, illustrated with Capa photographs that came out actually in September of 1944, just 3 months after the D-Day invasion. And you can imagine, this is well before print on demand. You can imagine the incredible pressure on Werdenbaker to produce this. The book in the middle, Extra, contains a version of the Capa D-Day myth, including an unspecified darkroom disaster. There's a book for young adults, for teenagers. And Capa's D-Day adventure is the last chapter in that book, and that's Robert Capa's first edition of his memoir, slightly out of focus on the right there. Next. These are Capa books, all of which contain the Capa D-Day myth, not only in English, obviously. Next. Here's Jean Maris on TV shows telling that story. He told it word for word, pretty much. It was a set piece. He also told it in books, his own books and books by others. Next. And he told it in newspaper articles, either magazine articles, either articles he wrote himself or articles in which others interviewed him or quoted him. And influence. And the myth eventually then became self-perpetuating, so it appears in books about Capa. Next. Sam Fuller's autobiography. Fuller's a Hollywood director who also went in on D-Day and also self-mythified his D-Day experience. Ingrid Bergman famously was one of Capa's lovers after the war. Stephen Ambrose's D-Day is considered the definitive history of D-Day. And that's a Time Life commemorative book about D-Day from, I think, the 60th anniversary. Now there are novels about Capa in which this appears, and other kinds of films about Capa. Graphic novels about Capa. There's a manga about Capa. There are Capa action figures. So the myth self-perpetuated, but it had a little help from its friends all the way along, obviously. This is from the National Press Photographers Association. John Morris revising his story. And just stop here a minute. This is a very interesting image that you're seeing. It was used to illustrate that National Press Photographers Association feature, which attempted to undermine our work. But what's interesting about it is those are Cornell Capa's hands that you see, and those are the remaining negatives, or eight of the remaining negatives of the Magnificent 11 or Magnificent 10, however many there were. And the picture was made by John Lowenbard for a book called something on the negative, in which he photographed the negatives on light tables. He photographed the negatives of numerous famous photographs. So what's interesting here is that you have Cornell Capa, who had extensive darkroom experience, and John Loengard, who had extensive darkroom experience, photographing these images in order to support a myth that they both had to know was not true because they had extensive darkroom experience. It's a strange image in that regard. That's not how it gets captioned, of course, but that's my caption for it. Next. So these are the questions that need to get asked as we delve into ICP's relationship to this myth. Keep going. This is Alex Kershaw. That's his unauthorized biography of Capa. Next. Next. That's Patrick Judy, French filmmaker, who nonetheless went ahead with his film. He was not able to use a short interview clip with Jean Maris, but otherwise forged ahead with his film. And he actually discovered a number of short B-roll film clips of Capa in various journalistic situations, including in Vietnam, just before his death. And this is John Loengard's response to our investigation. Go back to it. Which is a very strange position for a historian to take, I have to say. Next. Next. So I take heart from the fact that the two most recent books on Capa responded in different ways to our investigation. One of them, a graphic novel by Florent Silleray, published originally in France and now available in English, is, as far as I know, the only book on Capa of any kind to omit entirely the story of the darkroom disaster in London. The other is a French-Canadian meditation on the challenges to Capa's 1937 fallen soldier image, a kind of sort of a parallel investigation to ours, but not that we're not involved with. This book by Vincent Lavoie concludes with what its author and publisher must have felt was an obligatory commentary on our parallel research to the falling soldier research. So it took 70 years and the collaborative efforts of powerful institutions and individuals to embed this fable in our cultural consciousness. And clearly we have much work to do if we hope to dislodge this fiction from the mythology of photojournalism and photo history, not to mention the larger mythology of D-Day into which it has become so thoroughly woven. But at least that process has begun just in time for the 75th anniversary of D-Day coming up on June 6, 2019. So you can watch for it and bring whatever you've gathered from this presentation to that moment. You'll find our project online at capadday.com. A website entirely devoted to the project will go live online shortly. I have a book and a traveling exhibition and a film script in the works, which I'll announce at the blog as they evolve. And I'm developing a teaching module for classroom use. So I invite you to review the evidence and that we have gathered and form your own opinions about all this. Thank you. And now we'll open this up to questions. Yes, there are. The question is, what are the questions that are being raised about Falling Soldier, which is, as I'm sure most of you know this image, but it's a 1936 image of what seems to be has been presented as a Spanish loyalist soldier at the moment that he's hit and killed by a sniper's bullet. And there's a Spanish scholar, Jose Manuel Susperregui, Susperregui, R-E-G-U-I, Susperegi, who has basically found the exact location at which that happened, re-photographed the scene using digital technology to establish the exact vantage point, the height from which the picture was made at that location, and has established that through all this that the image was definitely staged. So that's his research has not yet traveled much outside of Spain, although it's available in English online. I'm in correspondence with him because we sort of crossed paths on the internet and found each other. But I take the research very seriously. I think the proof is definitive. Among other things, he shows that Capa had a habit, because he's analyzed other of Capa's photographs in the period. Capa had a habit, conscious or not, of slightly tilting his camera to the right when he photographed, as a result of which many of his compositions become more dynamic, because things seem to be happening at an angle rather than on a flat surface. And the man was actually standing on flat ground. This was not a hillside. This was a plateau, flat plateau. So where the picture was made. But there are also other pictures from that same moment, from that same day. There's one, for example, that shows someone else falling in exactly the same spot. So yeah, there are doubts, but there are different kind of doubts. We're not questioning. Our research doesn't question the authenticity of Capa's D-Day photographs. There was a D-Day; those people were there. Capa was there. All of that actually happened. It's more the mythology that comes out of it. Number one, that concerns us, and number two, what do those pictures actually show versus what the captions say, or what other people read into them, or what other people want them to say, or when do they want them to have been made? You know, that's really what concerns us. And my opinion is that Capa's reputation ultimately will survive both of these challenges. He made some great pictures. But I think this is really a project of media literacy in a way. This is really about what happens when you stop taking photographs for granted, when you stop taking captions for granted, and you actually look at the pictures, closely at the pictures, and say, what do the pictures tell us? Because often the pictures tell a different story. And you all know that. Those of you who are looking for journalists, anyhow, you will know this.
You mentioned something about the notes Capa made.
Yeah.
His captions, were they analyzed in any way? What did he say about the pictures?
Surviving, I guess, take a step back. Life magazine pre-printed up little sort of like pocket notebook sized sheafs of pre-printed caption notes. You know, they say Life magazine with the Life logo, and then there's, numbered pictures, blanks, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down to 36 along the edges of the pages. And I guess the photographers were supposed to fill these in so that they'd come into life in fairly standard form. Capa used pencil for his notes. There are four sheets of them. They're pretty general. You can find them at the blog and read them, but they're pretty unspecific. Yeah, there's no names of anybody. They're very vague. They're sort of one size fits all. Troops lounging aboard, relaxing, writing letters home. These boys are ready. Yeah, and that kind of sort of generalized propagandistic stuff. Why that was, I'm not sure. Capa was notorious for lousy captioning. I mean, sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he miscaptioned. He was careless, etc. He actually worked at Life magazine later more with another picture editor Morris was basically a glorified gopher at life. He had no authority to hire or fire anybody. He had no authority to give anybody assignments. He could propose stories to staff photographers, and they were free to turn them down. I think he sort of promoted himself in his own subsequent life to a more influential position than he actually occupied. But this other editor who worked with Capa later, actually would sit and work with him on his captions and actually draw out the information we needed because the captions were vague and undependable. So some of it may have been that. Some of it may have been not to alert the censors to something. Maybe. It's also not clear that the censors would have allowed anything specific in anyhow. We have to remember that at that moment, on D-Day, the Allies were still trying to persuade or convince the Germans that this was a feint, that this was not the real invasion, and the real invasion is going to happen further down the coast. You may remember that there was a very complicated scenario they had worked out with a fake installation, with fake airplanes and tanks, and General Patton was down there. George Patton, one of the big U.S. generals, and all of that was done to try to convince the Germans that the Allies were going to invade at a different place. So they were still trying to do that on D-Day. So the censors had every reason to basically, if Capa, let's say, the film, the roll of film on which we don't have negatives, the one roll of D-Day images from Omaha Beach, the first 2/3 of that roll are missing. The images that you saw from that roll are numbered 28 to 37, I think. What happened to those first images? Well, my guess now would be this. Now that I know that these images had to go through the censorship process first, I guess it would be they got developed by the censors. Capa would have made those photographs as that Higgins boat was traveling from the USS Chase to Omaha Beach. Those photographs, he wouldn't just have photographed the backs of heads of troops in the boat. He probably would have photographed what he was seeing around him, which was this vast armada. The censors would not have wanted pictures of this vast armada to show up in Life magazine when they're trying to convince the Germans that this is a minor thing and big activities down the coast. So it's perfectly conceivable to me that the censor said, whoops, sorry, and just cut those out. In some ways, it's the most likely case scenario. The Occam's razor principle, right? So I don't know to what extent the censors would have allowed certain things through, and I don't know to what extent Capa and other photojournalists at the time, life staffers included, would have self-censored because they knew in advance that certain things would be kept secret. But the caption notes are just, you can also find them in the book, This is War, Whelan's last book. And they don't say anything of value. So somebody was going to have to invent stuff about them. But he left he provided no caption notes for the D-Day, for the landing images. There's no sheet for that. Unless that also got taken by the censors, which is also possible. Yeah.
I'm curious about this laptop. Has anyone ever tried to
Right, Dennis Banks. That's an interesting story. When I published the book that I'm working on, synthesizing this material, one of the dedications is going to be to Dennis Banks and all lab assistants who have taken the rap for the screw-ups of other people. And if any of you have been lab assistants, you probably know what I'm talking about. Morris didn't name him until sometime he was just an unnamed lab assistant, until sometime in the 1980s when the rumor began to circulate that Larry Burroughs had been that assistant. Now, Larry Burroughs was there that night, but he was not a lab assistant. He was what they called a tea boy. He went for sandwiches, he made tea, and other people did the lab work. I don't know if that's because he graduated out of the lab. I think he had been a lab boy, but I think he graduated out of it. He was there for a darkroom assistant, but not.
Same guy.
Yeah, same Larry Burroughs, yeah. So he was there that night, and that's how the rumor got started, that he was the guy who had ruined Capa's film. And I think Morris, in order to contradict that rumor, decided he had to name the lab assistant. Dennis Banks did exist. We tracked down. Actually, it was Larry's one of Larry Burroughs' descendants. I think he had a son. I can't remember which. Who said yes, there was a Dennis Banks, and he actually had a life in-house publication of some kind with Banks's name on it. I ended up in correspondence with Doreen Landry Millichip, who was the widow of Bob Landry, who was the life staffer who landed on Utah Beach. I think it was Utah Beach. Yeah, Utah Beach. And she lives in England. And she tried to track down Dennis Banks by going through old, phone directories and things like that to see if, and so far it's been a dead end. So we have no idea. And we also have no idea whether he ever learned that he had been blamed for this. Because he was not named as the perpetrator until 1984 in a book that would not necessarily have crossed his path. So we have no idea. We have no idea. But there was all we can say is there was a Dennis Banks, and that's the person Morris named eventually. And we don't know what became of him, and we don't know if he knows. This burden of guilt that he's carried in the photo world for half a century or whatever. But we've gone down just about every path we can think of to go down, to track all of this down and follow up the loose strings and so forth. I'm sure there's more. Now that these archives in the Capa archive, these papers in the Capa archive are becoming available, I've got to go back and do a deep dive into those. Charles Herrig is working on a couple of blog posts about the censorship system through which we now believe Capa's film traveled before getting to Life magazine. There's others as well. So we're maybe 2/3 of the way through at this point, after 5 years. Over 10 photographs. Yeah, over there.
So, what was the policy for Army and Navy to take these photographers in? Because, of course, there is famous Robert Capa of Life magazine, but obviously there was much less known photographers. So, how did it happen?
They couldn't care less who these people were. Their job was to keep information out of the enemy hands.
And if just photographers suggested, could I be involved? Was that enough, or how did it happen that these photographers could go in to?
How could Robert Capa go in to Omaha Beach in the first place? The D-Day was planned down to the last screw, nail, water bottle, etc. And certainly down to the last soldier, and when that person went in on the first day. The only people who went in on the early waves were people who were absolutely essential to the success of the invasion. So there were no photographers in the first wave, in the first several waves. And as I said, there were 15 waves from the chase alone. And all of these waves were timed, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, different timings for different purposes, taking into account all of these fudge factors, we would say, high tide, receding tide, incoming tide, etc., that the planners had to take into account. So the Allies saw the press as effectively an arm of the military propaganda machine. And the press understood itself as an arm of the military propaganda machine. So it's pretty much unthinkable that any photographer assigned and accredited by the military would hide a roll of film away and try to get it published, outside of the approval system. I mean, you would have been dead in the water as a journalist, and your publication would have been dead in the water if you did that. So, and you would have been blacklisted, basically. So everyone was conforming to this system. When they felt that there was an appropriate slot for the journalists to go in, they went in. Most of them were signed. The photographers from Life, for example, Capa was the only freelance working for them D-Day, and they had specifically gone out after him for this job because at that time he had the reputation as the greatest war photographer in the world. So Life naturally wanted him to be their lead guy on D-Day. How that sat with the other Life staffers, I'm not sure. I think that they were probably cordial enough with him, but somebody from Life got bumped. So Capa, some staffer got bumped so Capa could go in. That can't have sat too well with whoever got bumped. Anyhow, excuse me a second. The photographers got to choose the units that they went in with. And most of them, I think all of them, chose units that they had worked with in the past. So they were going in with troops that they were familiar with, including the commanders of those troops who they were familiar with. That's why Capa picked the 1st Division, because he had been with them in Italy. And he knew them. And he also knew that they were experienced troops. And on D-Day, the Allies threw in a lot of troops who had never seen combat, what we call cannon fodder. So Capa wanted to go in with troops who knew what they were doing, but he was assigned, as most of the periodicals photographers were. He was assigned to regimental headquarters, which would not go in early. They would go in later, presumably after the beachhead had been established and secured, or at least established. Then they would go in the regimental headquarters and secure the beachhead and organize things and get people moving and all of that stuff. So that's how Capa got there. But Life magazine had only 2 slots for that. Everyone else from Life magazine would have to come in later. Or someone came in with the Air Force, for example, and someone else came in with, one of their photographers, George Roger, came in with the Brits because he was Brit himself. But they had only 2 slots for photographers to go in, even that early. And Capa was one and Landry was the other. And so Life magazine, Allied headquarters, designated how many photographers each periodical or the press pool could send in as early as possible. And Life magazine picked Capa and Landry for those 2 slots. I hope I made that clear. Okay, so that's how he happened to be there, and not David Sherman, for example. David Sherman rowed across on a boat full of medics, a small boat like LCIL 97, maybe, full of medics. And came back with them and never didn't land. He followed them over and followed them back with wounded. That was his story. Other questions? Okay. Thank you. Okay. And please remember, I have some notices here for the lecture tomorrow night. And if you stay around for about another 15 minutes, some other guy named Allan Coleman is going to come out and do some other kind of thing.
Thank you very much. What can I say after this? So now, if I understood, you are changing your hat.
Yeah, so you're changing it. It's a metaphorical hat because I don't have a hat, but I'm changing it.
Yeah, and just there. Now, Allan Coleman is presenting his multimedia work. After a little break, maybe we have a little lecture. Pieni tauko ja tämän jälkeen
Joku multimedia.
tulossa multimediasta. There's a little break. You're gonna go to take a little small pause. And thank you very much about this interesting presentation. I don't know what to say after this. Nothing maybe.
Ja mun puheet siellä. Otatko mulla osaksi permisen?
No mut ihan hyvä tehdä. Joku siellä vielä. Se on vaan Ville.
Okei, eli nyt tiedoksi, koska olemme hiukan myöhässä aikataulusta, niin multimedia-esitys kestää noin puoli tuntia. The multimedia presentation takes nearby half hour after the break. Telling that because we are nearby 9 o'clock.
Mulla on vieläkin live-striimaus päällä.
Okay, break is over. You can continue with the presentation. The name of that is spine. Suomeksi selkäranta, jos olen kääntänyt oikein. Okay, to part 2 is starting now.
At the beginning of December 1996, the US writer Allan Coleman and the Finnish photographer and book artist Nina Sederholm began an extended stay in the American Southwest. This topographically and culturally distinctive region of the United States is as different from the densely populated urban industrial context of the East Coast, where Coleman lives and works, as it is from the forests and lakes and icebound winters of Sederholm's native land. Each thus underwent a process of adaptation to a radically unfamiliar space, life, climate, and cultural mix. As they considered and shared with each other their creative responses to this cross-cultural experience, a joint project began to emerge. Sederholm photographed male and female nudes and the distinctive southwestern topography toward the production of a series of 30 resonant, toned, monochrome photomontages. Coleman commenced writing autobiographical poetry, short fiction, and creative nonfiction on southwestern themes. They invited Finnish composer Mikko Hassanen to add a musical score to the mix. The resulting collaboration bears the title Spine. By turns calm and ominous, joyous and melancholy, intimate and lonely, it constitutes a meditation on the survival of the human spirit in overwhelming solitude, the ultimate isolation of the individual psyche in the vastness of the enduring, timeless desert landscape. When they crossed over from the edge of Texas, heading west, the blizzard still raged, but it seemed as if someone with a giant broom stood right at the New Mexico state line, steadily sweeping the highway clean. After spending the full morning inching along in first, they began to make time at last, eventually pulling out of the final flurries of snow into sudden sunlight. On the outskirts of Albuquerque, they dropped into a basin of warm air, then turned sharply south, rolling the windows down and roaring on toward Tucson, through a world that, by sunset, was rich dark blues and purples on their left, orange and crimson flame on their right, clear for vast distances in all directions. Outside Amarillo, pissing on the snow halfway to Tucumcari, jackknifed semis strewn like roadkill in the whining wind. Sleet pelts my neck. My cock feels safe and warm in my familiar hand. They went on a January afternoon walk in the Arizona desert. At one point, they moved off in separate directions, she tracking the light with her camera, he scouring the ground. When she spotted him again, sometime later, and came up behind him, he was standing by a giant saguaro cactus, holding one of its pencil-thick needles as if it were the paw of a pet or a sibling's hand, and talking to it softly. She moved forward quietly, but he ended the conversation before she got close enough to hear what they were saying. The succubus came to him again in the night, all pinks and creams and golden down and slow-eyed heat. Reclining on a stainless steel cart, she wore protective boots and a technician's lamp smock with nothing on underneath. He didn't know how he'd come to this crisp, fluorescent corridor in some unspecific scientific enterprise. "They'll see us," she giggled, nodding toward some out-of-focus figures far down the hall as he came kissing close. Her eyes pulled him forward, but her knees thrust him suddenly back through a curtain into a dark, undefined space where, in a whisper, she commanded him to wait. Upon her return, she promised it would be better than anything he could have imagined. Dust, not grime or soot, but a fine pink powdered topsoil, would build up quickly on the car, even if it sat for just a day beneath the protective roof of the condominium's carport in Tucson. They learned to wait for evening downpours. They'd put on jeans and t-shirts, fill a bucket with soapy water, wipe the vehicle down with foamy sponges, and let the rain rinse it off while they went inside for a hot shower and dinner. In the morning, the little Mazda would sparkle. 2 days later, he could write his initials again in the film on the hood. Dream poem. In the delousing tent at the Mexican border, the small boy with the spray can tells me to muss my hair. You should look as though you've been swimming. His first time in Taos, July of 1962, he'd stayed at the only hotel on the small plaza of the sleepy little town. Wandering the cool corridors during the siesta hours, he had passed an open door where the hotel's owner was drinking and making out with the establishment's 2 hookers. They'd waved the shy boy in, plied him with his first tequilas, teased and flirted with him a while. Then the girls left to go about their business, and the proprietor turned avuncular. He led the boy down to a locked room off the lobby, its walls hung in dark velvet and illuminated like a chapel. Dozens of paintings by D.H. Lawrence occupied the space, sensuous and playful, quite accomplished, nothing like what he'd have expected from reading the prose. This evidence that writers could express themselves in other ways entirely would prove useful to him later on. The desert says, "When the glaciers of your life retreat, you will be left with me alone, and you will learn to live on next to nothing." Young and drunk, alone and maudlin in his cheap hotel room in Taos that summer, just a year and some months before the world changed forever for the worse, he had written, "I will get some sleep, and then I will wake up, wash my face, brush my teeth, put on a clean shirt, and go out to supper. After that, I will take a long walk through the hills in the sunset, looking at the purple mountains and the silver clouds, which were undoubtedly painted by El Greco, and I will whistle birds confirmation, and I will not be afraid of death. Sometime later, I will see if perhaps it is possible to create without destroying." A lifetime later, in the early months of 1997, he got to walk again in more than one New Mexico sunset, and in sunrises and noons soaked with astonishing light and color across Arizona and Texas too. He did not fear death and managed a fair amount of creating with a minimum of damage. But some infection, long since healed, had scarred the mucous membrane of his cheeks and then moved on, taking with it his ability to whistle. He hummed instead. Voices came through him now, always without warning. One or two were his. Some of the others he recognized, some he didn't, but he taught himself to remember what they all said, to listen hard and write it down. That seemed satisfactory to all concerned. Working at an archaeological dig near the banks of the Rio Grande that summer of '62, he had helped to uncover what turned out to be the oldest known European settlement in the New World. Traces of a few confused conquistadores who had strayed too far from some expedition, got lost, wandered north, settled down at last among some Pueblo Indians, interbred, and vanished from the records. It didn't seem like much to him, but it was considered important enough a find to make Time magazine. For obscure motives, he carried home by bus to New York City several bags loaded with Pueblo potsherds that no one else at the site thought worth saving. 30 years later, they'd crossed the country with him, coast to coast, another 2 times, and sat in the same, now crumbling paper bags in his basement behind the boiler. He knew there was something he was supposed to do with them. Just what that might be hadn't yet come to him. He wasn't exactly easy, but not unfriendly either. Likeable, in fact, even lovable to a few. You just had to approach him carefully and from certain angles. He didn't mean to be prickly. It was a matter of evolution rather than attitude. Tough skin and sharp points, but underneath it completely open, vulnerable flesh like any other living thing. She wondered during their early times together if he'd ooze a thick white milk when he got cut. The little Chicana with the big heart had driven him with her mother to the cemetery to visit the grave of her mother's husband, her father. They brought flowers, neatened the tombstone and the surrounding grass, reminisced about him, spoke calmly to his spirit. At first, he'd stood back a bit out of respect to give them privacy, but the younger woman had taken his hand and pulled him forward to include him in their group. He didn't know what to say except hello, but that seemed sufficient. On El Dia de los Muertos, he knew, they would come here with a boombox and a picnic basket to spend time in the company of the souls that had preceded them, in joy and celebration. He appreciated and envied their relationship to their departed family. It saddened him to realize that he had no dead so far with whom he'd care to party. The flowers of the cacti delighted him in a way that no others equaled. They seemed a proclamation of triumph, a spiritual affirmation from these plants, an assertion that even in this unpromising aridity, one could survive and find sufficiency and more, enough to call a bounty, express in waxy beauty, and share for the sheer exuberant pleasure of it. Pure, hard-won joy in vegetable form. New York, it turned out, was not for her. Too cold, no Church's fried chicken, not enough brown people. And though he liked San Antonio well enough, he couldn't have found employment there. So it hadn't worked out with the little Chicana, and they'd made the long ride back to return her to her home. But then it hadn't worked out for him with anyone for more than a few years. And though each was quite different and distinct, and he could tell himself and others a plausible story for the implosion of everyone and all the reasons why it didn't last, they still stacked up like the mile markers sliding past them on this endless Texas Badlands road. A pattern, apparently. Sometimes it seemed a comfort that at least the road stretched on forever, but sometimes not. He loved the dark, slightly smoky, slightly ominous flavor of mezcal. It was one of the liquors he could take straight and in whatever quantity he chose, without hangover or other repercussions. With these preferred tipples, tequila, bourbon, vodka, cognac with the others, he woke stone sober and clear-minded around 2 a.m., drank a glass of water, and returned to bed for deep, clear sleep. Mezcal was the darkest of them all, a drink for brooding over. And though he rarely drank alone, beyond the occasional post-work cocktail, he'd sometimes spend an evening letting that particular alcohol take him away. He especially enjoyed doing that when he'd gotten down near the bottom of the bottle, since it meant he'd get to eat the worm, the mezcal worm that infests the plant and whose preserved body authenticates the drink. In fact, he often bought the cheaper, more rot-gut brand, Dos Gusanos, because, as its name implies, it offered 2 worms instead of the usual 1. 2 experiences of that outer crunch and the inner mush. It tasted like the desert and death. He had some ideas about the woman he was looking for. He could visualize her approximate size and her shape. He thought she might play the harmonica. That would be a big plus. He was pretty sure she'd insist on eating the second worm. The wind blew hard, yet not quite chill, across the open Arizona range in the burnished gleam of the late afternoon sun. At his request, she stopped the car on the shoulder of the two-lane blacktop to watch the tumbleweeds whirl across the dry brown stubble of last summer's crop of hay. In the late 1800s, they'd come all the way from the plains of Tuva, between Siberia and outer Mongolia, these dry, tough, rootless plants, to thrive in this new playground. Against the barbed wire fence on whose weathered post he leaned, a few of them had caught and tangled. He spent some time working them loose and setting them rolling free again, imagining himself one of them. It struck him as a way of life not entirely without rewards. Panhandle. Sometimes it gets so large out here that you can plainly see just how someone could saddle up at night and race on off into the empty, shooting at the stars. And when we all tracked them down a few days later, sprawled in that ravine, clearly there was nothing for it, after much palaver, but to put them both out of their misery. The horse nigh dead, all busted up. The man still breathing, but plumb useless in his head, and not about to mend anytime soon. Colorfully painted, decorated with odd objects, clean and bright, the truck stop sat on a small rise a few hours' drive away from anything else. A gas station, a general store, a little chapel, a few houses clustered around it on both sides of the highway. Blink your eyes against the desert sun and heat, and you'd miss them all. They sat down in a comfortable booth and ordered. The apple pie was fresh, the coffee strong. The only customers at that time of day, they chatted up the waitress, who turned out to be the oldest daughter. Her younger sister, 7 years old, chattered and drew pictures at a table by the big front window, sitting next to her father and his brother. There was some mix of Mexican, Native American, and Anglo. Papa handled the kitchen chores, Mama ran the business. Her uncle was the law in both directions, drove the highway patrol between there and the adjacent jurisdictions. They all spoke 3 languages. The girls learned to read and write and do their numbers at home, took other lessons by mail, went to Sunday school once a month with the circuit rider priest. A completely self-contained, self-sufficient life with a radius of 100 miles at the end of the 20th century. A remarkable accomplishment. On the way out, after settling the bill and leaving a generous tip, he complimented the father on his pie. In that climate, in that space, in that light, certain things seem to dissipate, others to condense. He'd have a hard time holding a grudge there, he felt, but loneliness would stay always at his side. They'd come to the petrified forest, hoping to drive through, perhaps get out and walk for a bit, but it was closed for the winter season. the entrance gated and impassable by car, the weather too cold for hiking in the clothes they'd worn. So they settled for wandering around the shuttered and locked souvenir shop down the hill and across the highway. Out back behind it, they found a stone polishing machine and mounds of petrified wood, pieces small as an acorn or big as a man's fist. Something about that substance pulled him, this once living material, source of his beloved paper, turned by time to stone, as written words change experience into object. He took a few for his writing desk to contemplate, as other writers once used skulls. He'd assumed all brujas manifested wisdom, but the one who appeared to him displayed only that look of wisdom which comes with age, not its substance. She had kindness and affection and a certain sense of loyalty, though much more limited than his. She asked many questions that were difficult to answer, not because they tested his knowledge, but mainly because she seemed to lack some basic understanding of the way things worked. In fact, she expected him to be her teacher, which he found entirely confusing. It made him rethink his conception of brujas in general. Whatever happens for Keith McElroy, deluge of sunlight on the big empty, sharp hills wear shades of cloud like mourning garb. In the dark theater, a teacher draws Ganesh again and again, keeping in touch with his dear dead son. I sit behind him, hoarding no answers, holding no questions, expecting only whatever happens. Maybe it took more time to get to that point. Maybe he just never stayed out there long enough. But he sensed that the song had it all wrong. In the desert, he always remembered his name, every single letter, syllable, and sound of it. He'd driven Texas once in the winter, late '67, in what seemed another life entirely, a brief stint as a textbook salesman. Finding himself in San Antonio the morning after a light snowfall, the city's first in 20 years, he sat in a hotel's coffee shop over breakfast, watching out the window as inexperienced Sunbelt drivers skidded and crashed into each other at 10 miles per hour. Due north, where he was heading, it had snowed more heavily, then thawed, then frozen, the highway now a solid sheet of ice. With 2 prospects to visit and an evening plane to catch almost 400 miles away, he'd have to average about 65 to make it, or spend another night in another stale motel. Buckling himself into the rented coupe with its power controls, he told himself the cardinal rule: don't ever touch the brakes. He stuck to it even when passing a shuddering semi on a short bridge barely wide enough for 2 cars. Only once did he forget. Mesmerized by the all-white landscape, he missed a turnoff to the east on the Arrow Straight Road and tapped the brake pedal without thinking. Skidding, tires squealing, the car spun completely around twice. He steered with it until it stopped, facing back toward the turnoff. There'd been no cars behind him, none ahead. In fact, there was nothing but ice as far as he could see. It might have been Antarctica. Giving it the gas, he set off again. 15 minutes later, the adrenaline rush hit. He pulled over to the side, till his heart stopped pounding. A few hours later, he made his second appointment and then ran onto his flight home. He believed without embarrassment in the possibility of the existence of the jackalope, that mythical hybrid of jackrabbit and antelope portrayed on countless Southwestern souvenir picture postcards. This scape radiated a magic. Why could it not enable a blend of these two skittish herbivores? Sometimes he thought that from the corner of his eye, he saw one dart around the corner of an outbuilding. Sometime late at night, he caught the drumming of vast herds of them stampeding through an arroyo. He could understand how the mystics and shamans might lose themselves here in a landscape with its structure entirely revealed, like a lean body peeled down to its muscles, or a man's beardless face, all carved plains and chiseled hollows. A place where you could sustain no disguises and hide only in plain sight, needing absolute self-control as the only tool available with which to keep anything secret. The first time he visited the Grand Canyon, in the company of the old bohemian, he'd made a date with him to take a morning walk down the trail. But then his acrophobia kicked in. He'd thought that perhaps this chasm in the earth wouldn't activate it. After all, it represented a depth, not a height. Apparently, his vertigo made no such distinction. Walking toward the footpath, he found himself slowing, then coming to a sudden halt as dread overcame him. He could look out at and across that spectacular beauty, but couldn't find a place within it to occupy safely. Reluctantly, he waved the white-haired eccentric on and sat down on a bench to contemplate the vista and wait for his return. The second time, some years later, with her coaxing, he was able to bring himself to stand on the upper edge and look over and down. She took some photos of him there as if to prove that he'd come that far. At that rate, he figured, it would take him several hundred years to make it to the bottom. He consoled himself by thinking that at least he was progressing faster than the waters that had eaten through these rocks. But then he remembered that he didn't have nearly as much time at his disposal as they did. He'd begun to experience an unsettling mesh of sensations. Sitting in a cafe in Prague, he recalled a scene of profound generosity he'd witnessed once in Toronto, and a sudden wave of tenderness for him. Riding a winter bus in Manhattan, he would smell mimosa and plunge back into his childhood on the Côte d'Azur. Walking down a side street in Mexico City, he saw himself playing Robin Hood in a London suburb just after World War II. Now he stood in a Hopi cliff dwelling in Arizona, looking down at a grove of trees in a river's bend, and heard the faint yoiking of Lap reindeer herdsmen. It felt as if he knew no one culture to call his own anymore, but had somehow parceled himself out to them all, and they were all simultaneously calling his name. He was ready to go. He kept a suitcase packed up under his bed. They'd come in through the north, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Oklahoma City, Amarillo, Route 66. Heading back, they drove south and east. Texas went on forever as they left the West behind. He felt the true vastness of the continent for the first time, the sheer space of it, not inexhaustible perhaps, but still nowhere near filled up. That perception seemed to clear some congestion in his spirit that he carried for years, never realizing it until he felt it evaporate somewhere on the far side of Houston. The memory of this expansive spareness helped him accept the lush, baroque, almost oppressive vegetation of Louisiana and then Mississippi. In less than a day, they rolled from a topography of the necessary bare minimum into a landscape of the flamboyantly excessive. Thank you.
Thank you very much about this evening. And this is Finnish. Huomenna on luento Arkadassa kello 4 ja sijainti oli Arkadan sijainti. Where is Arkada? What's the address?
Okay. Well, this
Okay.
You will now hear my finish. Yorkis Hogeschool in Arkada, Jan Magnus, Jan